Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and to those who are following us on social media in this seminar organized by the GCC and the Arabian Peninsula Research Unit under the title Discourse on the Qatar 22 Power, Politics and Aspirations. It's our pleasure to host in this session theme of Qatar World Cup in the critical discourse and analyzing the media discourse in UK and French media outlets, and will touch upon the social and motivations and drivers. Initially, we will listen to Marc Owen Jones on reductionism and Orientalism, 10 years of media representation of Qatar's World Cup in the British press. Dr. Owen Jones is an associate professor of Middle East Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University, Qatar, where he lectures and researches on digital repression and informational control strategies. He is non-resident fellow at Democracy for the Arab World Now and the Middle East Council for Global Affairs, a PhD holder in Government and International Affairs from Durham University. His recent work has focused on social media disinformation and harassment in the Middle East. He has written on media and informational controls, revolutionary cultures, production, digital misogyny. Among his various publications are two monographs, Political Representation in Bahrain, Deception in the Middle East. Dr. Owen Jones, تفضل.
Hello.
Yes.
We're good?
Good.
Fantastic. And this is the clicky thing. That is the technical term, the clicky thing. Is it working? 100% right to left. Oh, I need to actually open it. So it's my bad. Okay, let's start again. Thank you, Aicha, for that introduction. I'm Marc Owen Jones, and I, like many of you, were probably here during the World Cup. And I, like many of you, were probably one of the people who was quite taken aback by a lot of the coverage of the World Cup. But then I questioned myself, as is good, and wondered, am I just feeling that these kind of headlines, this is an example from the Guardian newspaper, a British newspaper, outrage in Qatar after shooting of 29 dogs as it prepares for World Cup. I saw headlines like this and I wondered, well, what's the shooting of 29 dogs got to do with the World Cup, and what's it got to do with Qatar, for example? It, to me, was just one example of one of the, I guess, many incidences of coverage, news coverage, that was, it appeared unjustly biased. It was trying to conflate irrelevant acts with both the country and the World Cup. But I'd have these conversations, again, around the water cooler in a coffee shop of, you know, Qatar is being treated unfairly, it's being treated differently from other places in the World Cup. But obviously, how do we actually prove this? Is there an empirical way? Are there empirical ways we can try and determine the extent of this coverage, especially coming from European media? So what I thought I'd do was look at every newspaper headline from 9 different British newspapers over 10 years, so, well, 12 years, since 2010, the year that Qatar was awarded the World Cup, right? So I looked at about 1,735 headlines, newspaper headlines specifically, mentioning the word Qatar. The idea was to be agnostic, right? I was just interested in searching for any headline mentioning the word Qatar, because then we could see what was the nature of coverage about the country, how is it being framed in relation to events. So here's some high-level statistics. This is the number of articles I got mentioning Qatar. But what was very interesting, already one of the figures was the fact that of all those headlines about Qatar, 40% were about the World Cup, right? So when you think about that, that's a large number of any headline about this country just being about football, not any other topic about football itself. And so what I did with those headlines, I examined them to determine whether they were positive, neutral, or negative. And I looked at them over time. So what we can see here, for example, coming from 2010 to 2022, we can see the percentages of stories, or headlines rather, about Qatar to determine whether they were actually negative, positive, or neutral. And as you can see, it does change over time, but the predominant number of stories are, or at least a lot of them, are negative. And what's very interesting here, if you look at 2017, when we had the beginning of the Gulf crisis, actually, the negativity of the stories decreased somewhat, right? Why is that? Because the headlines about the Gulf crisis suddenly displaced Qatar and the World Cup. So what we have is a situation where, although the Gulf crisis was a bad thing, because it was a newsworthy event, it was now taking place, the coverage that would have been about the World Cup. But then, as you can see, as the Gulf crisis wasn't a new incident in 2017, you can see that the negative coverage of Qatar started to increase again as the World Cup approached. So what were the topics being addressed in all these in these headlines? Well, the most common topic of all was about human rights and workers' rights in Qatar. Many of you won't be surprised by that, but the empirical evidence now shows that that's the case. The second most common topic was sports-focused. These were stories that were just about sports, the game of football itself or other sports. And then the Gulf crisis. And then in fourth place was corruption and bribery. These were stories about Qatar and the alleged allegations of corruption and bribery. So we can already see that the most common stories about Qatar were related to human rights. And at least the third stories was about conflict. Again, a kind of common trope that you hear in British, well, Western representation of the region. And then corruption and bribery, another negative story about Qatar. So this is just the percentages of those topics. Again, if you look at the headlines about the World Cup, you can see that the second most common topic, 23% of all of those headlines, were about human rights and workers' rights. Here's a time series graph by topic. So what this shows us is from 2010 to 2022, the different frequencies of stories about Qatar, headlines about Qatar by topic. So what we can see again, there was a huge increase in articles about the Gulf crisis in 2017 and a steady amount of articles on other topics. But again, it just shows how the Gulf crisis was one of the only incidences in the UK media that attracted a significant amount of press coverage in addition to football and the World Cup. So again, topics by sentiment. This graph here shows not only which topics were popular and most talked about, but also which topics gathered the most shared, were the most shared and retweeted on social media. So as we can see, workers' rights, again, the most popular topic, corruption and bribery, Qatar mistake, and stripping. Whilst LGBTQ rights were talked about a lot in the media, they weren't actually that common in headlines. But why you can see, why is the LGBTQ column fatter is because although it wasn't the most common used topic, it was one of the most widely shared on social media. So it was considered something that was shared a lot, despite not appearing in headlines as much as others. What does this show us? This shows us which newspapers focused on which topics more. So you can see, for example, that The Guardian, 27% of the stories in The Guardian were sports-focused, 29% were about workers' rights. So you can see, for example, that The Guardian newspaper, of all British newspapers, focused the most on workers and human rights, whereas The Telegraph focused most on corruption and bribery. The Daily Mail, a more right-leaning newspaper, focused predominantly on sport, right? So we can see, roughly speaking, along the spectrum of British newspapers and stance, which stories they chose to focus on when they were writing about the World Cup. And again, this is sentiment by paper, right? So this shows which newspapers were more negative about the World Cup in their headlines. You can see The Sun The British newspaper Sun, which is a tabloid, many of you have probably heard of it, was the most negative. 80% of all headlines about Qatar were negative. But we have to remember, the Sun didn't actually do that many stories about Qatar. The newspaper that did the most stories about Qatar was The Guardian. And The Guardian did a large number of stories about human rights and workers' rights, but also football. But you can see, ranked according to negativity, you have BBC News, The Guardian, Telegraph, Daily Express, The Independent, Metro, Daily Mail, and The Times. But all of those newspapers, over half of the headlines about Qatar could be considered negative. So I did what I thought was interesting. Let's compare this same technique to headlines about the Russian World Cup. What's interesting about the Qatar World Cup and Russia is they were both awarded on the same date, right, in 2010. So that means we can have the same time period where we can compare stories about Russia and Qatar. And what's really interesting about this is that the total number of percent of stories about headlines about Russia that also mentioned the World Cup was about 2%. Now remember with Qatar it was 40%, right? But let's also remember that there are way more stories about Russia. But it's still significant. Even though there were way more stories about Russia, there was only 225 stories about, or headlines about Russia that also mentioned the World Cup. Whereas with Qatar, it was over 500, okay? So in terms of percentages, this 4% versus, or this 2% versus 40% is a huge distinction. And what this tells us is really that a lot of the headlines in the British press about Qatar were mediated by the story of football and the negative story of football. And if we were to ask the question, has, for example, the British media treated Qatar or represented Qatar and the World Cup the same as it's done Russia, we can quite clearly say empirically, no, it did not. But I just want to give you a few overview of some of the headlines. Again, just to reiterate, 40% of headlines about Qatar were about the World Cup. 65% of those headlines were negative. The most common term in all the headlines was World Cup. Except for the key terms Qatar, FIFA, and World Cup, the most common word in any headline about Qatar was workers. And human rights and allegations of corruption were the most salient themes. So that's some descriptive overview. In terms of potential reasons, why is this the case? Why has Qatar been treated differently than Russia, say, in its representation? I don't think the reasons are necessarily straightforward. There's more than one, and I'm sure some of us all have our own theories, most of which are probably truthful, right? Firstly, on a very basic level, the evidence has suggested that representations of smaller countries is more negative in the media, okay? Of course, then we go to the notion of how does the media, especially in places like the UK, report on the Arab world and the Islamic world and the global south in general? Well, we know this is predominantly more negative. There have been studies done on the British media representation of the South Africa World Cup. There have been studies done on the British media representation of the Cricket World Cup in India. These have all found similar things, that the media generally portray these events more negatively using Orientalist themes. So this is not necessarily new to Qatar, but there's an argument to be made that the scale of this particular representation is much different. A slightly longer time frame. In terms of actual sheer numbers, remember the Russia World Cup was 2018, so we've had 4 more years of potential negative coverage. What's interesting thing, if, for example, the World Cup had been held in 2018, remember in the preceding year, the negative coverage of Qatar had actually dropped. So those extra 4 years also had an impact on the total volume of negative coverage. Another interesting thing to remember is it was a hostile environment at the time. There is a lot we don't know about why the media coverage was framed the way it was. But what we do know, because of the Gulf crisis, we know that there was various companies, and there's evidence for this documented on the American Department of Justice website, that highlight how firms were working for other states in the region, engaging in information operations designed to promote negative content about Qatar. Now, one of these companies is Cambridge Analytica, or rather its parent company, SCL Social, who worked with the UAE Supreme Media Council to do an adversarial campaign on Qatar. According to documents submitted to the US Department of Justice website, we know, for example, that some of the techniques they did, in addition to creating social media accounts on the Boycott Qatar hashtag, was to promote articles, negative articles about Qatar. One of the articles that they promoted, for example, was about North Korean slave labor in Qatar. So we know, for example, that these campaigns made a difference. When it comes to things like soft power, a supportive regional environment is necessary. Qatar did not have this. And then there's agenda setting and news values. After a certain threshold, if there's a number of negative stories, the amount of frames of interpretation about a particular place become solidified. Many of you might have spoke to journalists prior to the World Cup and ahead of it, but certainly when I did, I was asked, do you have any stories about X, Y, Z? About human rights, about corruption, or anything else. So the desire for stories was also limited. But I think one of the most important things here is just to acknowledge that empirically now, rather than just speculate, we have ways of determining over time, empirically, if this negative portrayal of the World Cup was actually true, then yes, we can. We can know that. And again, this doesn't discount the existence of real harms or human rights violations in any country, but what it does highlight is the issue of focus. Why do some countries get focused on in different ways than others? And I use the Russia example simply because in the time that between Russia being awarded the World Cup and it hosting the World Cup, there was the annexation of Crimea, there was the shooting down of the Malaysian airline. In the UK media, there was the poisoning of the Skripals. So there's no reason to believe that in terms of human rights, there was any difference. Yeah, Qatar is a small country. In the British press, was represented in a significantly more negative way. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this very, very interesting presentation. We should have taken more time. Huh? And for having this deconstructed the negative coverage of the Qatar World Cup. المداخلة الثانية التي
The second presentation will be on the campaign against Qatar World Cup, an analysis of the French media discourse. Dr. Hichem Akoubache, and please allow me to, Dr. Mohammed El-Fatih Hamdi is an assistant professor at Qatar University since 2019, a specialist in media and mass communications, is the editor-in-chief of several international scientific journals, and he run training courses in the skills of analyzing communications, and he got his PhD from the University of Algeria. His focus is on media, mass communication. He has 10 books to his name in this field and many articles in peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Hichem Akoubache is a professor at Qatar University, and he used to be head of department at an Algeria University, and he taught at the same faculty for many years, and he took part in many international events, and is an associate editor of Al-Hikmah journal, and has many contributions, and the latest book is on mass communications and Middle East media in Arabic. Dr. Hichem, 20 minutes, please. Assalamu alaikum. In the name of God, the most merciful, most compassionate. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all and express my gratitude to the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for allowing us the opportunity to take part in this discussion on the discourse on the Qatar 2022 World Cup. We will try in this paper to take into consideration some examples of the discourse on the Qatar 2022 in the French media and French papers. Our intervention will be on the campaign against the Qatar World Cup, an analysis of the French media discourse. Without further ado, I'll say something about the paper. It will be a brief glance at the paper and to allow more time for discussion during the Q&A session. Let's consider first of all that as an entry point into this field to mention certain things which the French media consider. We look at what Liberation has written, this paper, which is considered one of the main left-wing papers. It says bad money, euro dollars, excessiveness have acted together to behind the organization. This is just a short extract I took from one of the France 24 channel, and the program tried to give examples, and in this very short video we can understand the atmosphere surrounding the event and the discourse, which was this was around October 2022. So therefore, as an introduction, I say that some French media outlets waged a campaign against the state of Qatar because of Qatar's hosting the World Cup 2022. And this discourse focused on some aspects in order to distort the image of the state of Qatar regarding the environment, the misuse of the expat community workers, and also to refuse to grant the rights of the LGBT community. This is basically what we try to discuss in this paper, and we will focus on what some, if not all, of the French newspapers have focused on and try to portray the negative aspects of Qatar. Also, we will try to take into account some samples, analyze them, and in the end we try to analyze this discourse and to understand what were the motives behind this negative campaign, and to know what kind of themes they tried to focus on in order to portray Qatar in a negative way, and the background to all of this, and what are the reasons or the motives. So therefore we'll try to take into analysis few examples only from French newspapers to analyze some aspects of this campaign in this discourse. Let's start with the first theme, and that is the methodology. We adopted the discourse analysis methods, and discourse is to study the text and its context, and these are media or newspaper articles and coverage. Of course, we adopted certain tools like the signify the references and the actors, analyze the actors and the significance of the ideas and concepts covered. As for the sample, we took 4 newspapers: Le Monde, Le Figaro, L'Équipe, and Le Parisien. Why these particular newspapers? Because they are national papers and they carry a weight in the French media. For this reason, we focus on L'Équipe is a sports newspaper, so we try to take that into consideration, despite the fact that this is a newspaper which specializes in covering sports. We discovered that it was biased and delved into the political arena when it came to covering Qatar and 2022 World Cup. Some of the headlines we see, for example, in the L'Equipe in Paris, will not show this or cover these matches. Another headline that some European teams will display the rainbow signs. And the Figaro also said, and it's one of its headlines, that France supports the compensation funds for the foreign workers. Le Figaro's headline says that Qatari newspapers condemn the negative coverage or campaign against Qatar. By and large, the headlines were similar to this, and so therefore the first tool of analysis is the content analysis and the significance of this content. They focused on the main themes or issues, and the main issues are human rights, for example. They focused on like the human rights concept was the dominant figure. The Figaro says that the French Football Association supports the fund to compensate foreign workers. Le Figaro, Le Monde, Le Parisien, and L'Equipe also called for the respect of human rights and linked that to 2022 World Cup, accusing Qatar of violating human rights and to follow a policy which contravenes with international norms when it comes to the rights of workers, without providing any facts or figures or statistics in support of what they claiming. Also, there was a politicization of the human rights. Of course, there are in every country there is always those who have an interest, a vested interest in utilizing these issues for the sake of political point scoring or whatever. That's why the question of human rights was focused on. Although, if we look at the human rights, this is something which has been dealt with, and there are violations everywhere, even by Western countries which brag about human rights, and they consider that the human rights can be used and exploited sometimes. Like, for example, at the time when these themes are talked about in Qatar, they totally ignored issues which are raised about France and other European countries about the rights of migrant workers and the misuse of their rights. So therefore, they try to focus on the discourse of human rights in Arab countries and in Qatar in particular, yet at the same time they ignore the conditions of migrant workers in many Western countries, and this is what we call uh, this is one of the things which these newspapers mentioned or focused on. The second concept, which was also part of the coverage, which was like the basic liberties and the LGBT community rights and the refusal of Qatar to promote any symbols. And these newspapers called upon Qatar to do that in disregard of Qatar's own traditions. And L'Equipe had a headline saying that 8 of the European captains of football teams will be wearing the rainbow bands, and also at the same time the same newspapers have ignored the discussion which is at the level of European countries which pertains to LGBT rights. There is a lot of debate which talks about that, but these newspapers focus on the Arab countries but ignore the discussion and debate about the same issues in Europe. The third theme was the environment, and like in their headlines, the newspapers try to focus on the environmental issues, to say that what was done in Qatar was a source of pollution and harm to the environment, although there are facts to the contrary, and the claims by these French papers are not basing their claims of any tangible evidence. We see this indicator which shows that the European Union ranks third in polluting the environment, and there is no evidence to show that Qatar damages the environment. The second or other theme was the theme of the boycott. Many of the articles published in the month of October, the same period, and October 2022, there was a lot of hate speech and hate incitement calling for boycotting the World Cup. Some also went as far as to name this incident or this event as the most controversial in history. The pretext for the boycott was given as the lack of respect for basic human rights, workers' rights, and also there were other calls for boycott before the World Cup regarding the Argentina World Cup, South Africa World Cup, and also the call by Mussolini in the 1930s of hosting the World Cup when he tried to brighten the image of the dictatorial regime in Italy. So they tried to link between all these themes and link it to Qatar and placing Qatar amongst the dictatorial regimes. They are implicitly trying to say what happened in Argentina and what was about to happen in Italy is similar to what is happening or going to happen in Qatar. 5 minutes, please. Now we move to the second tool, and we mentioned some political trends and the headlines of these newspapers. We found that the right-wing newspaper and we know the right-wing parties focus on the issues of Islam and produces a lot of hate speech and discourse against Islam and Muslims, and this was evident in when we analyzed the content of these newspapers, their coverage. Then the opinion pieces and the articles, when we analyzed them, we discovered that they are linked more to the right-wing newspapers. Some of the themes were saying that Qatar is a conservative Islamic state. Qatar has a Wahhabi regime, and in the analysis of the taglines, we will find that the discourse, by and large, was immersed in commercial and the attempt to attract more readership and the kind of sensationalization and dramatizing the news, and also of course they talked about Wahhabism and the Islamic principality and others which will impact negatively the World Cup, and also amongst other issues that we noticed is the lack of respect for the local and traditional. As for the references, it was the way these discourses were dealing with what Qatar has done was a reductionist way, a dichotomy of Orientalist views, and which really are surrounded by a lot of misrepresentation, misinformation, and which were the source for this coverage, and also European centralism, the idea that the East still remains as a strange place to European ideals, and also always this kind of historical background, and I can refer you to what Mr. Rabah did and what are the sources, and also they by and large focus on the novelty, dramatization, more than basing what they say on facts and figures. They employ the services of so-called experts in this field. The conclusions we arrived at after analyzing these discourses, they are far from the truth. They are aimed at misrepresentation, misinformation, misguidance even, and they are presented without any objectivity or evidence-based, which are a condition for any media organization. Also, the presence of political, economic, and other considerations in the coverage, double standards, and the attempt to distort Muslims, and I conclude by that, and I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you for keeping the time, and thank you, Akoubache, Dr. Hamdi, for this insightful presentation. The two papers are complementary to each other. They converge on several themes. Before we open the floor for discussion, I would like to give you some room, as we still have some time, to talk a little bit with more elaboration on Orientalism. You have alluded to Orientalism as a background for the negative discourse in the English and the French media. In 1 or 2 minutes, if you may elaborate, Dr. Hamdi, Dr. Marc Jones as well, if you may. Thank you. Shukran.
I'm sure most of us here are familiar with the notion of Orientalism. And I think, as Dr. Hichem has noticed, this is obviously a key theme running through so much of the coverage. But I think what's really important about Orientalism, it's not just about representations, negative representations of the non-Western world. This is a big part of it. But it's about a system of knowledge. It's about a way of knowing and understanding the Middle East and the rest of the world, or the global South, that allows people to actually believe these negative stereotypes that they hear. First of all, obviously within the Orientalist framework, it's the idea that much of the Western world and the media conceives of places like the Middle East as this barbaric place, a backwards place, a place that is uncivil, right? If you have that mindset about a region, what that means is that people are going to believe these negative stereotypes far more easily. And I think that's what's really interesting. Firstly, if we look at, for example, in the presentations I get, we see the negative headlines. The headlines about Qatar, for example, are predominantly negative. But it's not just about negativity. It's about limited numbers, a limited way of seeing a place, right? Not complexity. You look at Russia, where there was 2% of headlines about the World Cup. For Qatar, it was 40%, right? The rest was about crisis. For the British media in this context, all the Middle East, or at least this World Cup represented, all that was significant through that framework of Orientalism was football and conflict, right? So if you reduce the complexity and nuance of a place when you represent it or write about it, that's fundamentally Orientalist, because you're actually negating all the possibilities of understanding and interpreting a place. And I think that's a really powerful thing. It's, again, about representation, but it's about focus, what is focused on. And I think one thing I think is really important to remember is the kind of story, one thing I didn't mention in the presentation, of all the news articles analyzed, does anyone know which was the most shared on social media? Have a guess. Guardian, yeah? But which one? Absolutely, right? So the most shared article of all those 1,700 articles about Qatar was that 6,500 workers had died in the lead up to the World Cup. Now, we know this number is not true. We've known it for a long time. But for most of us, that sheer number would appear absurd, especially when you saw it in, say, that Washington Post infographic, where you saw like one person died in Sochi or London, and a few died in Sochi, and then you suddenly saw reams of these little red figures for Qatar. You have to abandon a certain amount of critical thinking to look at that infographic, or the number 6,500, and believe that to be a plausible number, right? But I would argue that one of the fundamental aspects of Orientalism is that if you were conditioned to see a region in that kind of way, the notion of believing 6,500 is not hard for you to do, because you've been conditioned in this way to believe that the place is barbaric. You'd have to believe that a place is barbaric and backwards to believe that number to be real. And I think that's what's a really important part of this Orientalist notion, right? What the World Cup coverage has done has actually showed us that these figures, like 6,500, which is misinformation. So just as a side note, the most shared article about the World Cup in British language was misinformation. A side note is that an aspect of Orientalism we need to look more on is how these representations have created, or Orientalism has created, a means of trying to, allowing people to easily believe implausible stories about a region. I can leave it now for that, but I want to talk about sports watching related to Orientalism. Do you want me to come back to that later?
Yeah, probably in the
Okay.
discussion.
السلام عليكم ورحمة.
Hello everyone, assalamu alaikum. With regards to Miss Aisha's questions, honestly, when we monitored the media campaign against Qatar by the French media, we were not very surprised. Why? Because the latest study we conducted on the French media and it's addressing Muslim and Arab issues. Years ago, we conducted a study about the French teacher case, and we remember that the French media, audiovisual or written media, always stems from that dark perception and tries to establish the stereotype about Muslims and Arabs as portrayed by the movie industry. They try to hire Merc writers, be it Arabs or Muslims, present stories or depict stories through their studios and to raise some issues concurrent to key sources through monitoring and tracing the campaign. It wasn't launched with the FIFA World Cup 2022, but rather since 2010, since Qatar was awarded the portfolio. When we review the editorial policy of any media institution, why such a campaign, why at this time, why such media outlets launch such campaigns when such and you will notice this in the upcoming FIFA World Cup. How will the French media will deal with the FIFA World Cup event? We have noticed that they have recruited a large number of authors and media person, and this is based on every media institution's policy. We know owners or editorial staff who try to consecrate the stereotype perception, saying that Arabs and Muslims, that they don't respect human rights, and that the overspending as the stadiums that were constructed in a very short period of time at the expense of people's lives, and talking about liberties, public liberties, about a group of people that we have never heard of them, and they said that Arab and Muslim communities in France need to respect them. However, when we saw that Qatar has banned some anomalic behaviors or norms, the UK and the French media, why were they calling for freedoms for such a group, allowing them to practice their rights, forgetting that they were banning some claims of some migrants to France or the UK, and they tried to cover up for such groups and for such communities in France. And how would they cover the discourse from one aspect and always reflect the beautiful face of or aspect of France? So they tried to depict the state of Qatar as the invasive emirate, a small country that disrespects human rights and liberty. Majority they talk from their screens, from their offices, based on agendas developed in their laboratory to attack Qatar. And I've noticed that when they promoted the boycott of the FIFA World Cup, not only visiting Qatar but also boycotting the FIFA World Cup in public squares. And we have noticed that in France, people didn't even watch the matches. When I conducted the study, I requested some of my fellow media pen to go around. They said even these cafes would be packed, fully packed with it, but these newspapers, they didn't want to deter people from visiting Qatar, but rather influence the international opinion and to talk about human rights, LGBT rights, and environmental issues. However, there were some intrinsic messages, but it was never believed because their excuses was very feeble. Yes, they depicted some girls from Saudi Arabia and the French and the French media was talking about women rights and human rights. Let's open the floor now for questions. Let's start with the gentleman here. Kindly introduce yourself before you ask the question. Thank you.
So,
And he speaks, he understands Arabic.
أنا ما أفهم العربي بس حاسس أنا أتكلم بالإنجليزي. Trust me.
First of all, thank you. These beautiful papers and presentations, and based on this, by way of study, we have a tendency that focus on quantitative rather than qualitative because it has figures and numbers. And thank you, really, thank you for the papers presented in this session. And I wish that if there were no pre-thinking by Marc and the other that we need to produce a book, some sort of document that that compiles all these papers, focus on the Qatar FIFA World Cup. If we go back 10 years, we would see that there is a case that is dealt in the media in the Middle East, and then we cover the three themes. Orientalism is always there, stereotype, and framing. We find it now. It's 15 years since we started today. So I wish for Mike, it's rather than a question. You have worked on social media, so I wish that today we need to have an indicator. Through such an indicator, we can measure the problem on how do the Westerners look towards the Middle East or the Arabs. Qatar FIFA World Cup, Gulf crisis, Palestine cause, whatever you call it. We need to have an indicator through which we can overcome the theme of Orientalism and talking about it to another stage on breaking down the case or the condition to further understand it. Thank you. اسمي ياسمين.
I have a question for Marc Owen. We know that there were violations of workers' rights because of some reports of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. Even at Al Jazeera, we spoke about it many times. Qatar even recognized and changed policies. So how do we recognize these violations and acknowledge the mistakes of the past and the number of real deaths and real injuries and violations that led to changes made by Qatar, and see the difference with like an Orientalist or a racist and subjective sort of directed attack towards Qatar because it's a Muslim Arab country, etc. How do we defend human rights and stay fair, and at the same time acknowledge that share of unfairness towards Qatar?
سنأخذ سؤال من هنا.
تجاه دولة قطر. We'll take the question from here. After that, we go to Zoom, and then we will go in another round. Let's talk 4 questions, and then we open the floor again. My name is Ilyas Khalil. I am a professor here at Doha Institute. My question is to Marc. Let me speak in English.
Talking about representation and so on, as if like it is kind of a question of knowledge. But what about action that is really that these countries, how do they interact with, so it is not a question of only representation but the consequences of this. And so there was a sense maybe of a change in balance of power, so to speak, that if we are going to treat Qatar on an equal footing, that means, and it is Qatar taking this symbolic step as an act representing the new ethos of Arabs and Muslims. So really it is kind of there is a leveling of field concerning action. And so there is a question here that is a kind of competitiveness or an act, I'm sorry to use that word, but great jealousy that is not, it goes beyond a question of epistemology and finding out and categorizing different cultures different than for the French, but there is an element of competitiveness and jealousy.
شكرا.
في مثل هذه الفعالية. Let's take two more questions via Zoom. Dr. Hans Honsted and Simon Chadwick.
So I'll let you go ahead first.
Thank you, Hans. My name is Simon Chadwick. I'm going to be speaking this afternoon. We know that negative coverage was there. We can conceive of it in lots of different ways. So my question is takes things off in a slightly different angle. And it's a simple question. Why did we see this coverage? Was it a response to the market? In other words, the readership of media outlets? Was it purely an editorial decision on the part of these media outlets? But perhaps more significantly, and what I'm keen to know more about is do we think that the coverage was an outcome of who owns those media outlets? Because I suspect that there were certain agendas at play because of the owners of those media outlets. Or was it because of some outside political influence? And we've seen, for example, in Britain over the last week, Gary Lineker being asked to step back from his role with the BBC, having tweeted a political statement. And yet, as many of the people in the audience will know, Gary Lineker now infamously introduced the BBC's coverage, the start of the BBC's coverage of Qatar 2022 by making a 2-minute long political statement. So I wonder, just to kind of restate that question, why did we see this coverage? Was it because of, was it appealing to the marketplace, the readership? Was it because of an editorial decision? Was it because of the owners of the outlet? Or was it because of some kind of outside political influence?
Thank you, Simon. Second question? Hans?
Yes, yes. Just building on the last presentation by Akoubache and Hamdi, and also linking up with what Simon just said, it's curious to register because, I mean, the press cover or the media coverage of the Qatar World Cup, both in the years preceding it but also in the beginning of the tournament itself, the week before we left to do field work, it was so obvious that coverage was so negative. and you have to ask yourself, why did this spread through parts of in Northern European media? So we have the French, we have the British, we have most of the Scandinavian, I would say, and maybe also including Germany. I know someone in Canada who said it was the same there, and the Netherlands, Belgium. So you're talking about sort of the Northern Hemisphere who did a particularly negative and in an attempt to. And you may ask, what are the agendas behind it? And this is obviously what we have to discuss. It was like journalists, of course, you're sort of pursuing a story, and journalists tend to, it's their livelihood. They want to pursue stories, and sometimes they don't step back. Whether it's an intended political agenda behind it, or whether it's also part to do with the nature of journalism. You're chasing a story, and we all agree on the premises of the story, and the story is, in this case, is that Qatar World Cup should never have happened, and then
Thank you.
you can start analyzing whether this is Orientalism, xenophobia, racism, Islamophobia. But that's a much wider discussion.
Marc, you have a couple of questions on your hand.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. And I'll try and get to most of them. I think, answering what Khaled was saying, I think with the techniques we have now, what you could actually, I say easily do, it's not that it's easy, but it would be well within the means of possibility to create a system that, for example, analyzed all outputs from, say, major media or mainstream media about certain places, whether that's the whole world or particular countries in the Middle East, categorize their output in an automated fashion, and not only categorize how much coverage of that place there is, but whether that coverage is based on certain themes and topics. And you could actually have an interactive database, I mean, if you had the funding to do this, that would give an automated and real-time analysis of, for example, how a particular country or political figure was covered. So that's well within the realms of possibility. With the right funding and research team, you could do that. And I think it's something that would actually be important, especially for the news gathering industry, because I do think, I'm not hopeful, but I think there needs to be a lot of soul searching in the media generally, but particularly Western media, and I think there maybe is a degree of it, in how they've represented it. I know a lot of journalists have been very defensive when confronted with this notion of Orientalism. I actually had this conversation. Someone was like, "I'm not racist." I was like, "I didn't say you were racist. I said you were Orientalist." So I think it expressed an element of not understanding. But it could be done, and I think it needs to be done. I think it would be a really important project, and not just with mainstream media, but with social media itself. I think the question about, how do we balance this need for proper critical coverage of domestic affairs with what would be, I would say, equitable coverage of domestic affairs. I think, again, going back to this idea that there are human rights concerns and issues that are reported. I mean, I read an interesting article in Foreign Policy that was suggesting that one of the problems, I mean, there's numbers of problems, we can talk about governance and politics, but one of the problems from a journalistic level is perhaps an absence of solid investigative local journalism that can analyze a lot of these facts, or at least the perceived level of autonomy in looking into those facts. Although I don't think that's a sufficient explanation. But I think those things need to be documented, and to some extent they were. I think the issue was always that there was a disproportionate focus on what Qatar wasn't doing in comparison to the same problems that you saw in other regional states. So again, it was this shifting of focus. It wasn't that there wasn't coverage there, it was just that there was so much coverage. And the coverage that was either critical or highlighting government policies to try and address those things was not salient, or it was ignored. And I think that's another issue. And to tie in the question of jealousy, I think there is many variables going into this notion of not just representation, but how the World Cup ended up being perceived and these kind of even actions. And this is what I was saying about, whilst we talk about Orientalism as a useful framework, there's a lot going on. We can't ignore geopolitics, right? I mentioned in the presentation that you need a supportive regional environment. But beyond the Gulf crisis, there was more going on than the Gulf crisis. We've got this this normalization occurring in the Gulf states. We've got this hostility generally towards Turkey and Qatar. Or, I work on disinformation. I see campaigns that look to be aligned with Israel's foreign policy, also trying to attack Qatar. The issue is, when there's networks of manipulation, for most of the time, we don't see them. A lot of the nature of the manipulation of the information space, which is a lot of what we're talking about, is unseen. So the example I mentioned, of the case with Cambridge Analytica, manipulating this information space in a way that was detrimental to Qatar, is just one example. It's a tip of an iceberg. I mean, Linton Crosby, the team who helped Boris Johnson get elected, they pitched a project to the Qatari opposition in London to have a media campaign that would criticize the Qatar World Cup. £5.5 million. We don't know if it was launched. Cornerstone Global, another company, also pitched a similar project. You know, again, the idea was to criticize, get the World Cup in Qatar cancelled through placing media stories, creating grassroots social media campaign, but also specifically through, for example, connecting Qatar to the Muslim Brotherhood, right? Whether you think these things are right or wrong is not relevant, but there is clearly a slightly larger campaign to portray Qatar, not just as an inappropriate place to hold the World Cup where there's human rights violations, but as a specific actor in the region that is hostile to political interests of other groups of actors, right? So there's these huge things. And just to tie in that last question, I think those things address this notion of campaign. Yeah, there's Orientalism. Yeah, this Orientalism affects the coverage. But then there's also political interests and PR firms who, there's an industry of people who manipulate the information space, and they work for people who have particular political interests. It's not conspiratorial thinking. There is evidence to back this up. So I think we need to start looking, there needs to be a larger scale analysis of the coverage of the World Cup. And it's not just about the British media, but it's about European media and other media. And it's a project that requires, I think, a lot of collaboration from a lot of different people.
Thank you. ما زال عندنا مجال
I'll start from here. We still have another round of questions. We have 10 minutes. Let's take 4 questions.
I think the issue of bigotry and racism is very clear in this whole attacks that happened in Qatar. But I want to propose a different thought. Qatar is a small upstart nation when it comes to football. How do you take the center of gravity from Europe, where the Premier League is the richest league in the whole of the world, and take this thing and take the economic benefits that can arise from this and put it to a state like Qatar? So that's, I think you mentioned it a little bit in your talk about the economics of it, but I think we need to look at that too, because, you know, bigotry is fine, racism is fine, but everything revolves around money.
سؤال ثاني.
Another question? محجوبة داودي. أنا محاضرة مغربية.
Diplomat at the Fourth Committee on New York, United Nations. Also a human specialist, human rights specialist in Geneva since 2009. So I have a question for Dr. Marc. Were there any statistics done during the World Cup and after it, just to compare between the waves of hate before the World Cup and what the world had seen by its own eyes, and to compare between, and if these newspapers had returned to the right side? نفس السؤال موجه أيضا إلى الأساتذة حيث أنكم تطرقتم إلى
Gentlemen, as you have talked about the French media, and as we know, as we people of the Arab Maghreb, of their hatred towards Arabs and Muslims due to the history between us and its defeats in its foreign policy, especially with Morocco and African countries. Thank you.
I just want to maybe bring the methodological dimension to this on the media content analysis, and maybe one of the criticism will be that depends which lenses you will be using. If you will be using the lens to find all the negativity in the reporting, then you will find negativity. But whether any space for any positive comments or positive, or not at least positive, but neutral positions that were also present in the reporting about the Qatar 2022 FIFA World Cup, knowing that there were many journalists from those newspapers who were here and then doing, you know, the kind of their field work here and reporting from within. And the other dimension is we are talking about two countries where Qatar is investing significantly in terms of on a number of sectors, including in sports, for France with Paris Saint-Germain. So were there any dimension as well, the economic dimension, commercial dimension in terms of interest that been also were highlighted in the comments? And if they were not, then one will ask the question, what's the impact of this Qatari investment in those two countries? And if there is any way maybe for Qatar to rethink about its strategy when it comes to investment in those two countries.
شكرا. السؤال الرابع لا سيدا اليوم.
استثمار في تلك البلدان. My question to Hichem Akoubache and his colleague: has Qatar and the other Qatari media outlets any responses to such fierce campaigns? Like France 24 was involved, and they presented many programs. I have watched one of them in Oncat exclusive, and they depicted a very bad and negative depiction of the state of Qatar. So the question is, has the Arab media outlets in terms of action and reaction, or was the response was silent and have many other significances as the battles and the or is it that the reality of the event and the actual organization in the opening ceremony and the closing ceremony is a response unto itself to such claims, accusations, and allegations? My other question is with regards to talking about indicators. Do we have the capacity to remember the network knowledge and to map, because some of the American labs are involved in this type of analysis. So in our online studies, we do network mapping as presented in some labs. As in American labs, they have listed 6 million terminologies that is related. So therefore, do we represent this network dimension of such studies and develop it from the perspective of when one of the audience asked about an Arab indicator of such issues? I wish we could take more questions. However, we are running short of times and we have only 4 to 5 minutes and several questions. So we would suffice with this amount and let's go to the answers. I would like to respond to 1 or 2 questions. As for the question by Dr. Hans, that we have some findings to analyzing the stories by French media, and the question is whether such articles or coverage is with a political agenda or the owner's agenda, or is it just a matter of the very nature of the work of journalism. We have studied such articles and discourses, and we gave some indicators that indicate some political agendas that led such campaigns against Qatar 2022. Maybe I didn't allude to or discuss it in my presentation, but we can point out what Germany has done and France to make the campaign as to boycott 2022. Some people say this is related to Russian-Ukrainian conflict and the energy crisis during that period. So we shouldn't rule out such an indicator that there is a political agenda or political indicator in mobilizing such negative discourse against Qatar and the FIFA World Cup. The other thing is that we couldn't rule out is the economic agenda. However, in the end, I said that in our conclusions and our finding, be it the French media or the Western media in general, they have their ethnic centrality and draws a lot on its resources, draw from the historic records of such countries, as they have colonized many of the Eastern countries, including Arab countries. So this cultural and historic record has a direct relationship with producing such discourses. When we go back to the French media, we would find that many depictions and many discourses and rhetorics are directly associated with this historic historic stock, and between these with these countries. As the other question about the methodological aspect of analyzing such discourses, we didn't talk only about the negative aspects. We kept an equal distance from these articles or headlines, and we didn't only focus on the negative aspects. Over 1 month of study, we found that many of these articles, part of these articles, and I could say fairly a big percentage of them, has lots of smearing campaigns and negative depiction of the state of Qatar, reflecting the methodology that the French media has adopted in covering this issue. We were not intentionally focusing on the negative coverage. I'll move to Dr. Hamdi to give us a brief comment. I just would like to add what Dr. Hichem has just meant, and commenting on your question. When you see the major dailies like Le Monde, Le Figaro, or L'Equipe is one of the most prominent dailies that have a huge influence on the French and international opinion. The unfortunate thing that is that the ethics and the codes of ethics hailed by these outlets, talking about objectivity, and have fallen several times. We didn't on purpose target their negative, but if we find them in some them to be positive, we wouldn't have conducted the study. However, the repetition of such negative articles actually proves the negative, and they call and raise and throw in our faces the cause of ethics. However, we say that in Arab media, what has been said and what is being said in the French media every day, they assassinate such values, such ethics, and such codes of conduct, and they try to cement this by depicting Arabs as being against rights, against values, and claim that they are more befitting to defend such rights. And one of the participants in Zoom, what are the backgrounds? The backgrounds are known. There are historic, cultural, religious backgrounds, and through their agendas they try to consecrate. Whenever the matter is related to Arabs and Muslims, you would notice this. And in the near future, any crisis, even if Qatar has investments in Qatar, this wouldn't prevent such dailies to attack us with all these mumbo jumbos that try to attack such events. And if there are any other events to be organized in other countries, you will find the same reaction. Thank you very much. I would like to add to all these factors maybe the power relations, or the factors, as this FIFA World Cup was conducted within soft power implementation, and in the discussion, despite all these rhetorics and discourses in the UK and France, the negative ones haven't been successful in their endeavors, as Qatar has jumped 6 places in international soft power ranking and became 24th internationally among 120 countries. And what is remarkable, according to the conclusions of this indicator, there has been improvement on controversial issues, as Qatar has jumped 11 ranks in terms of tolerance and respecting human rights. And what is more remarkable is that in this global indicator 2023 or index that based on a research conducted prior to the FIFA World Cup says that in the next year they anticipate or expect that Qatar's ranking in soft power and the global index for soft power that would be much more better because it hasn't been completed so far. So this is something that we have overlooked in our discussion, and I'll go back to the final response by Dr. Marc.
I think money always talks, and I think there's a certain amount of this idea that the Premiership, as you mentioned, is actually one of the leagues that created this monetization of football, and now there seems to be this animosity for Qatar for joining that framework, right? With regards to your question, Doctor, I think unfortunately right after the World Cup there was Qatargate, right? So the British media in particular were all focused on that. So I think there was just this continuous shift of negativity. But you could do a study, for example, on how perceptions of people who visited the country changed over time, and I know some people are interested in doing that. But I'll say that for now. Thank you.
Okay. شكرا جزيلا.
هذا ممكن. We will leave it here. Thank you very much indeed. Now we'll have a lunch break and we'll be back at 2.